Is the richest person in the world really Elon Musk? Or was there once a king so powerful that he could crash the economy of an entire continent by himself? Welcome to Money Legacy. In this video, you won't just see billionaires, you'll see how money has shaped and controlled the world itself. How did Mansa Musa's gold trigger inflation? Why is Rockefeller considered the true architect of modern capitalism? Was Pablo Escobar really the man who held the most physical cash in history? By the end of this video, the way you think about wealth will completely change. Because some people didn't just make money, they used it to reshape the course of history. To match Elon Musk's fortune with an average salary, you would have to work for 30 million years. That's roughly half the time between today and the age of the last dinosaurs. Every second during this video, Elon Musk earns around $3,000. Before 6 minutes even pass, he has already made another $1 million. Enough to buy the dream house and luxury sports car that most people could only afford after a lifetime of work. Through companies like Tesla, SpaceX, Neuralink, X, and the Boring Company, Elon Musk became the first person in history to reach a fortune approaching $500 billion, and if his wealth keeps growing at the same pace, he could become history's first trillionaire. But being the richest man alive today in absolute numbers does not necessarily make him the richest person in history, because when we look into the past, there were people who controlled far greater portions of the known world. So let's find out who the richest person in history really was. First, let's begin with one of the most unusual examples. Pablo Escobar. In just a decade, he built a network so efficient that he turned an illegal product into one of the most profitable businesses on earth. In other words, he was the king of logistics. His personal fortune is estimated at around $30 billion adjusted for inflation, an enormous amount but still far behind Elon Musk. But unlike the other names in this video, Escobar's wealth wasn't tied to stocks or political influence. It was pure cash. He is often considered the person who possessed the largest amount of physical money in history. He reportedly spent over $1,000 a week on rubber bands just to bundle stacks of cash. Every year he lost nearly $2 billion because the money would rot, get eaten by rats, or become damaged by moisture. There are even stories claiming that while hiding from authorities, he burned $2 million in cash just to keep his family warm. By contrast, Elon Musk's fortune, like that of most modern billionaires, doesn't sit inside bank vaults. His wealth exists mostly in the estimated market value of his companies, which fluctuates every day with the stock market. Now let's move to the early 20th century. The United States was still a young nation, and oil was beginning to power the modern world. At exactly this moment, John D. Rockefeller, whose story we also covered on Money Legacy, built an empire that controlled nearly 90% of America's refined oil supply. His company, Standard Oil, became so dominant that the government eventually forced it to split into 34 separate companies. Among them were names that are still giants today, such as ExxonMobil and Chevron. But ironically, this attempt to reduce his power made Rockefeller even richer, because he still owned shares in all the new companies, and their stock prices skyrocketed. By 1913, his fortune had surpassed $900 million. At the time, that represented about 2% of the entire U.S. economy. For comparison, Elon Musk's wealth today equals roughly 1.6% of the American economy. According to Guinness World Records, Rockefeller is considered the richest person in modern history, with an inflation-adjusted fortune estimated at around $631 billion. Rockefeller used part of his wealth to establish the University of Chicago. Over time, it became one of the world's most prestigious institutions, producing 101 Nobel Prize winners and 27 Pulitzer Prize recipients. But Rockefeller's greatest impact went beyond money. He transformed industrial capitalism into a science. Before him, business was chaotic, family-run operations, inconsistent accounting, and unpredictable pricing. Rockefeller changed the rules with 3 revolutionary ideas. First, he standardized processes. Consistency creates profitability. This principle would later be adopted by giants like McDonald's. Second, he controlled prices and crushed competitors. Since he controlled the entire supply chain, he could lower prices to impossible levels, eliminate rivals, and then raise prices again afterward. Third, he laid the foundation for modern corporate power. Rockefeller was one of the first to understand that a company did not have to die with its founder. A corporation could become an independent machine where professional managers replaced visionary entrepreneurs. That is why he wasn't just the richest man of his era, he was the man who taught the modern world how to become rich. Around the same time, another man was changing the way humanity moved forever: Henry Ford. Ford did not invent the automobile, but he perfected the assembly line that made mass production possible. He also doubled workers' wages and reduced working hours from 9 to 8 per day. As a result, production time for the Ford Model T dropped from 12 hours to just 90 minutes, while the price fell from $950 to only $290. For the first time in history, workers could actually afford the products they produced. Soon, millions of people began living outside crowded cities and commuting by car. Suburbs, highways, traffic, and modern daily life were born. Henry Ford didn't just change industry. He created a new middle class capable of saving money, consuming products, and dreaming of a better future. His wealth reached around 1.3% of the U.S. economy, slightly below Elon Musk's current level. A few decades earlier, another major figure had risen: Andrew Carnegie. Born into poverty in Scotland, Carnegie immigrated to America with almost nothing. He had no formal education, no powerful connections, and no inherited wealth. Yet step by step he climbed upward until he controlled the steel industry that built modern America. Carnegie became the world's first true self-made billionaire. His company built the skyscrapers, bridges, and railroads that connected an entire continent. When he sold Carnegie Steel in 1901, his fortune equaled roughly 1% of the U.S. economy. But the most remarkable part came afterward. Instead of dying as the richest man in the world, Carnegie chose the opposite path. He funded universities, established over 2,500 public libraries, and famously wrote, "The man who dies rich dies disgraced." Before Carnegie, wealthy people donated money mainly for religious or symbolic reasons. Carnegie completely transformed philanthropy into a professional mission and a moral responsibility for capitalists. Later, billionaires like Rockefeller adopted the same philosophy. And while industrialists were reshaping America, emperors still ruled vast parts of the world. The last Russian Tsar was Nicholas II. On paper, he owned almost everything: land, mines, banks, taxes, railroads, and armies belonged not to the state, but directly to him. His fortune is estimated at around $300 billion in today's value, but his real power could never be measured by a single number. He controlled the oil of the Caucasus, the diamonds of the Ural Mountains, and the lives of more than 150 million people. Ironically, the same enormous power that made him wealthy also destroyed him. During the Russian Revolution of 1917, he was overthrown and later executed with his family in a basement in Siberia. Centuries earlier, one family had already transformed money itself into a dynasty: Mayer Amschel Rothschild and the Rothschild family. Starting from the Frankfurt ghetto, Mayer Rothschild realized something revolutionary: trust could travel faster than gold. He sent his 5 sons to Europe's major financial capitals: London, Paris, Vienna, Naples, and Frankfurt. Together, they built a synchronized financial network complete with private couriers, coded messages, and even carrier pigeons. While armies took months to deliver orders, the Rothschilds could move financial information across Europe within days. They lent money to governments, financed wars, and even supported Britain during the Napoleonic Wars. In many ways, they created the world's first global banking network. Their fortune became so immense that they were wealthier than many countries of their time. Around 1850, the family's combined fortune is estimated at between $300 and $600 billion in today's value. They were the richest family in history, though not individually. Nathan Rothschild of London, the wealthiest brother, personally held a fortune estimated around $20 billion. Centuries before the Rothschilds, Europe had already been financially dominated by another man, Jakob Fugger. He transformed his family business into a massive financial empire trading metals, spices, and credit. Fugger became one of the first bankers to lend enormous sums to kings and popes. In return, he gained monopolies over copper and silver mines. His loans financed wars, crusades, and even the election of Charles V as Holy Roman Emperor. The financial system behind the indulgence sales that triggered Martin Luther's protests in 1500 was also tied to Fugger's network. But he didn't only accumulate wealth. In 1521, he founded Fuggerei in Augsburg, Germany, a small housing complex for poor families. 5 centuries later, it still exists, and the annual rent remains almost unchanged, just 88 cents per year. The only condition is that residents pray 3 times a day. His wealth equaled roughly 2% of Europe's economy, equivalent to around $400 billion today. While European bankers lent money to kings, there was one ruler in Africa who never needed to borrow from anyone, Mansa Musa. He controlled the gold mines of the Mali Empire, which produced nearly half of the world's gold supply. In 1324, during his pilgrimage to Mecca, he traveled with 60,000 people, 12,000 servants, and 80 camels, carrying over 300 pounds of gold each. As he passed through cities, he distributed massive amounts of gold to display his wealth and build alliances. But he released so much gold into local economies that the value of gold collapsed, triggering inflation that reportedly took over a decade to recover from. In today's terms, his fortune is estimated between $400 and $500 billion. Many historians consider him the richest individual in history because he possessed enough wealth to destabilize entire economies by himself. And 2,000 years ago, there was a man who needed neither stocks nor banks, Augustus. After defeating Mark Antony and Cleopatra, he became the first emperor of Rome. Among the spoils of victory was Egypt itself, which became his personal property. Its mines, grain reserves, and taxes belonged directly to him. The Roman Empire represented roughly 25% of the global economy, and nearly 1/5 of that was under Augustus's direct personal control. In other words, about 5% of the world economy belonged to a single man. Relative to global wealth, Augustus may have been the richest person who ever lived. In modern terms, that level of economic control would equal nearly $5 trillion. But this wasn't literal cash, it was absolute economic dominance. And if we go even further back, we arrive at one of the oldest kings mentioned in recorded history, Solomon. According to the Bible, he received around 666 talents of gold every year, equivalent to roughly 22 tons. On top of that came trade revenues, taxes, and gifts from neighboring kingdoms. With this wealth, he built the legendary Temple of Jerusalem and transformed Israel into one of the major trade centers of the ancient Middle East. Modern estimates place his wealth somewhere between $1 and $2 trillion. But unlike the others, much of Solomon's story exists in the realm of legend rather than verified history. Still, few rulers in the ancient world concentrated so much power and wealth in one place. So who really was the richest person in history? If we are talking about absolute numbers, the leader is Elon Musk. If we are talking about physical cash, the crown belongs to Pablo Escobar. In terms of GDP dominance, Rockefeller ruled his era more completely than almost anyone else. For family wealth, the Rothschilds remain unmatched. In terms of the power to disrupt entire economies, no one compares to Mansa Musa. And if we are talking about direct control over the world economy, Augustus existed on a completely different level. But if we measure influence on the everyday lives of millions of people, Henry Ford may have been the most impactful of them all. And perhaps this ranking reveals something even deeper. Every fortune only makes sense within the conditions of its own era. Mansa Musa was unimaginably rich in gold, yet he lived in a world without electricity or vaccines. Solomon built golden temples, but never knew gears or the concept of zero. Even Elon Musk, despite all his billions, depends entirely on people continuing to believe in the value of his companies. And maybe the most shocking truth is this: The richest people in history were powerful enough to buy the world, but none of them could buy more time.